So welcome to our lesson about the revised dopamine hypothesis. Last week, I asked you to study the original dopamine hypothesis on your own, and I'll go back over that in a moment. But the lesson focus for this lesson is to actually understand how the revised dopamine hypothesis can explain both positive and negative symptoms, which is something the original hypothesis couldn't do. Revised means it's obviously been improved. So let's have a look. So what I want you to be able to do, the tasks that I want you to do this week, I'll put a deadline for it on Classroom, is to complete the AO1 section on the summary sheet about the dopamine hypothesis, both versions. And I'd like you to draw a flow chart explaining how the two pathways can lead to positive and negative symptoms. And if you can draw that, that gives a good idea that you can really understand how this hypothesis works. Don't forget to paste those to the top section of your electronic exercise book. Okay, so just a quick review of the original hypothesis and how neurotransmitters works. You have seen this last week, so we'll go fairly quickly. So we have an axon terminal, an electrical impulse comes down the axon, and it pushes these vesicles, these little bubbles full of neurotransmitters, and it pushes it towards the end of the axon terminal. And then neurotransmitters are released into the synapse or the synaptic cleft. Some of the neurotransmitters bind on receptors on the dendrites of the next cell and stimulate that cell. However, there are some that are just left lying around in the synapse. Some are kind of removed by enzymes, they're sort of cancelled out, and others just kind of drift away. Any that are still there after a while are reuptaken by this neuron here, ready to be recycled. Okay, so that's how normal normal neurotransmitters works. So the original hypothesis said that people with schizophrenia produce more dopamine than normal brains, and it's the schizophrenia that is responsible for the symptoms. It's the dopamine that's responsible for the symptoms of schizophrenia. And they had three places where they say, look, here's some evidence to support this. There've been some studies with drugs. There's been some studies there's post-mortem studies, and there are PET scan studies. So I'll just quickly run through that material, and that is the stuff that you will have looked at already, but just to be really clear. So from drug studies, well, first of all, let's look at a couple of brains. Now, if we look at this one here, this is the normal amount of dopamine in a normal brain, and here we have a brain of someone with schizophrenia. And you can see we've got raised levels or elevated levels of schizophrenia in these different parts of the brain, specifically in what are known as the D2 receptors. And those D2 receptors, particularly at the front, are to do with guiding attention. So it's been found that if we lower the amount of dopamine or the dopamine activity in a brain, we can reduce the symptoms of schizophrenia. Okay, so where's the evidence of that? So the first bit of evidence is that actually drugs can show us that dopamine are involved, because if people take drugs that increase the level of dopamine, those are known as dopamine agonists. An agonist is something that increases the level of a neurotransmitter. So if someone takes amphetamines, this increases the level of dopamine in their system, and large quantities of that cause people to experience symptoms of schizophrenia, such as delusions and hallucinations. So normal people take amphetamines, increases their dopamine, and they experience schizophrenic symptoms. If you give amphetamines to schizophrenic patients, then their symptoms get worse. And you'd probably be raising your eyebrow there and thinking, oh, how ethical is that as an experimental procedure? Okay, so people with Parkinson's disease have got low levels of dopamine. And what has been found is that by giving people a drug that was remarkable, known as L-DOPA, that increases dopamine activity and actually helps people with this symptoms of schizophrenia. However, if they take too much L-Dopa, raising their levels of dopamine even further, then they start developing schizophrenic symptoms too. So we can see here there's a fairly straightforward, and it looks like a straightforward link between increase the level of dopamine, increase schizophrenic symptoms. And also just at the bottom there, if we actually give chlorpromazine, which is a dopamine blocker or antagonist, reducing the amount of dopamine, then that reduces schizophrenic symptoms in people. Okay. Second type of evidence is to do with postmortems. So postmortems are things that are done to people after they're dead. You slice up the brain, as you've got a nice picture there. That is actually a brain that's been sliced in sections. And they found that people with schizophrenia, people who with schizophrenia before they died, had a larger number of dopamine receptors than normal. So again, for evaluation later, you might be thinking, well, how, what are the strengths and weaknesses of doing a post-mortem study? Could anything have happened, for example, between death and this stage here where I think the brain has actually been cut up? Okay, so we've got postmortems. That's another thing, but again, we were talking about there's a connection between more dopamine receptors and schizophrenic symptoms. PET scans, the evidence may be not quite so strong. So you've got one piece of research done by Zhedi and Wong in '87, and they found that people with schizophrenia had twice as many dopamine receptors as people without schizophrenia, people or control people. So that was in '87. On the other hand, Fardy et al. In 1990 suggested that actually in their research they couldn't find a difference between people in terms of dopamine receptors between people with schizophrenia and those without. Okay, so again, there's a problem there. Maybe this evidence isn't as strong as the first two bits. Okay. Another problem with this is that we're saying there's a connection between dopamine and schizophrenic symptoms. But the question is, what comes first? Is it schizophrenia that's causing the levels of dopamine to rise, or is it dopamine that's actually causing the schizophrenia? Okay. So that was where the original hypothesis got to. So now what we look at, and one of the major problems with the original dopamine hypothesis is that it explains positive symptoms, hallucinations, and delusions, especially. However, it didn't really seem to explain the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So, rather than just getting rid of the theory altogether, psychologists looked and said, "Okay, how can we improve that? Is there a way that we can actually make it a bit more subtle, if you like?" Okay, so the area that they looked at to try and see if they could get a better understanding of dopamine is in the limbic system. Now, that's a variety of structures underneath the cortex. And so if you see the word subcortical, that means any structure that's underneath the cortex. And that's got many functions, including things like emotion, memory, and arousal. And so what people were looking at was, is there anything happening in the limbic system that might be able to explain the symptoms of schizophrenia? And there are two particular pathways, two particular sort of lines within the brain that people have used in this. Okay, so there are nerve pathways that go from the limbic system to other bits of the other subcortical bits, other bits underneath the cortex. And also there's a pathway that takes that transmits from the limbic system all the way up to the cerebral cortex. So these two pathways are called the Mesolimbic Pathway and that's connecting bits within the limbic system. Then the mesocortical pathway, which connects the limbic system to the cortex, the cerebral cortex itself. Okay. Now, hopefully this will be, so maybe we might be thinking already, oh, I wonder, you might ask yourself, I wonder if there could be a connection between one pathway. We've got two pathways, right? And we've also got two types of symptoms, positive and negative symptoms. You're probably asking yourself, because you're generally ahead of what I'm saying, you're probably thinking, oh, I wonder if one of these pathways is to do with positive symptoms and one of them is to do with negative symptoms. Because if it was, that would be an improvement, wouldn't it? Because this system would then be explaining two different types of symptoms. So the first pathway is the mesolimbic pathway. And if you can remember these technical terms, they're not as bad as they sound, and they're fairly straightforward. If you can remember them, it just impresses examiners and people. It sounds very technical and very biological, and makes you sound even a greater psychologist than you are already. Okay, so this pathway connects the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens. Now, the VTA, ventral tegmental area, is a place where the dopamine is made in the brain. Okay, and it's sent to the nucleus accumbens as a reward. So if you're watching a football match and your favorite team suddenly scores a goal and you're feeling great about that, then you're getting a hit of dopamine in that way. People who have been suffering withdrawal symptoms from not smoking for a while and then have a cigarette, they get a hit of dopamine from doing that. Okay, so it's a pathway where dopamine is made in one place and then it's sent to this nucleus accumbens, and it's seen as a reward, which is kind of like if you like, a buzz or a good feeling. Okay, and the theory says that in this pathway, if there's too much firing of these neurons, if the neurons fire too much or too quickly, then it causes the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. And that kind of makes sense, doesn't it? If you were getting something where it's increasing our excitement or that kind of stuff, then lots and lots of that might affect we might begin to feel overloaded by our surroundings. Okay. Now, this is the area that's targeted by antipsychotic drugs. Okay, so the mesolimbic pathway is clearly connected to positive symptoms. So in your notes and your summary, when you're writing on the summary sheet, that's going to be an important connection. Okay, oops, just gone back a little bit. And then the second pathway connects the ventral tegmental area again. That's the area that produces dopamine, don't forget. And this time it sends it onto the frontal lobe, passing on information about emotional responses. And so the argument there is that if this pathway isn't working, so if I'm feeling, so for example, a good example would be when we saw the video, schizophrenia, stolen lives. And we listened to one of the twins speaking there, the one who was very good at art. He was saying things like, I got awards for doing drawing and all that kind of stuff, major important awards. But he said it without any real emotion. So the explanation for that here is that there's not enough dopamine going to the frontal lobe to tell him, if you like, that he should be excited about that. So when he talks, it just sounds very flat. It's that symptom called flatness of effect that we've talked about before. So here we have the second pathway, the mesocortical pathway, and that is connected to negative symptoms. Okay, so what we've got then is quite neat, and it's always probably going to be more complicated than that in real life or when you go on to study further at university. But for now, we've got a good way of remembering stuff. So we're saying that the mesolimbic pathway, the first one we looked at, is connected to positive symptoms, and that's too much dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway, in the D2 receptors. It's connected to too much. It's connected to positive symptoms of schizophrenia, and then not enough dopamine in the D1 receptors in the frontal lobe, in the mesocortical pathway, leads to the negative symptoms. Okay, So use the information that I've given you here along with your textbooks and complete the tasks that I've asked you to do. And I'll see you at the next video. Thank you very much.